Good evening and welcome to the ASQ Innovation Technical Community. Tonight, we are so pleased to have as our guest, Mr. Vidusha, who will be talking about collective leadership. We are so glad to see that we have attendees far and wide tonight from around the globe, not only our esteemed speaker and his business partner, but our esteemed members as well. Again, our speaker for this evening is a founder and destiny architect of High Five Consultancy. He's going to talk to us tonight about how the world has changed and evolved, and his radical program of collective leadership and how that's going to enable you and your organization to shift your paradigm through practical, logical, and proven methodologies that enable leadership at a new level. You are so lucky to have a phenomenal consultant, coach, master speaker, author, as well as business entrepreneur and owner, making a difference across the globe in so many leaders and organizations' life. He has been featured on 10X for the Leadership Learning Framework. He has been recognized as the world's top 30 in leadership professionals by Global Gurus Top 30, and is listed as one of the top 50 thought leaders by Thinkers 360. He is also an organizational cultural champion. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Vidusha as our main speaker tonight. Anton, would you like to share now, please, for Vidusha?
Many thanks, Rhonda, and thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I do hope I can be heard loud and clear.
Perfect. You are coming through perfect, sir.
All right. So let me kind of run through the slides, and after that, we can actually take the Q&A. I do recommend everyone to ask questions without thinking too much about it. I'm not the most. I don't take offense to any question. So let's put it that way. You can ask me absolutely anything about what I have spoken. Challenge me if you need to, and that would probably be rich fodder for a conversation. So I want to take about 20 to 30 minutes on what I call context setting about redefining leadership as a collective process. But before I do that, can I just get a quick census on what leadership means to you and how you would actually define leadership? Don't worry about jargon, don't worry about textbook definitions. What it kind of looks like to you and how you would define leadership and what you think are good characteristics for a leader to have. Can I quickly, just for a minute or so, if you can just type this out and share it with us? Would love to hear your thoughts and sentiments. And based on that, let me try and kind of give you what I think about it. That will be a far better way of doing this rather than me just blurbing out. Can I start there? Right, someone for others to look up to as a role model. Great, fantastic. Okay. A visionary, someone who has a clear vision and what they want to achieve and being able to communicate that vision clearly to their team. Excellent. Okay, keep going. A few more. Right. Adaptability. Yep. A good leader is someone who's adaptable and can adjust their approach to changing circumstances and situations. Yep. Confidence. Absolutely. But what does leadership mean to you? Those are all great characteristics, and I agree with every single one of them. Yep. Has to be a continuous learner. Absolutely. A Good leader is always looking ways to improve himself or herself. Absolutely. And is open to feedback from others. Yep. The ability to communicate effectively. Agreed. What does leadership mean, though? So those are all great characteristics of a good leader. Empathy, absolutely. I love this, George. Thank you very much. Ships do not come in, they need to be brought in. Absolutely. A person who can bring people together, help them grow, serves the people they are responsible for. Absolutely. Just maybe one or two more in the interest of time. A definition for leadership as you see it. What does leadership mean to you? So leadership is the ability to inspire, guide, and motivate a group of people towards a common goal. It involves influencing, directing others to achieve a desired outcome. Great. Super. Anything else? One more. One more. Great. Yep. So leadership can be demonstrated in various contexts such as business, politics, sports, community organizations, etc., servant leadership, transformational leadership, situational leadership, amongst others. Fantastic. So, right. So this narrative of leadership is pretty much exactly what we are taught. And the problem with that is that it's no longer suitable for the environments we are in. Anton, shall we go to the next slide? Next one. So when you talk about leadership, 9 times out of 10, what happens is that we've made the horrible mistake in the past, and we continue to do this. We look at leadership from the perspective of a person. And that's how it has always been, from Alexander the Great to Caesar to Mahatma Gandhi to Nelson Mandela to presidents to basketball players. We've defined leadership, even in the business arena, as a task that an individual undertakes. And the problem with that is that it is a very, very narrow definition of what actually happens in leadership. Now, for starters, leadership is a verb, it's not a noun. A leader is a noun. Leadership is what they do, it's a verb. So, most of the time, the person approach to leadership makes you want to have this assumption that it is one person who is doing it. Notice the fact that we look for characteristics of a leader. And that's what we have been doing even in management and leadership studies. Even if you take an academic textbook of leadership, we are looking at starting from the characteristics of a good leader and then trying to see how we can inculcate that in ourselves or in others. Leadership training, even though it is $1 billion business or a couple of $1 billion and now projected to being something like $12 billion worldwide, is still looking at competencies that an individual must have. And therein lies the fundamental problem. The problem is that no one person can actually lead effectively. Because take a look at all the characteristics that you listed out. Doesn't it quite seem like a superhero that you're trying to define? You have to communicate effectively. You must be visionary. You must be empathetic. You must be able to network with others. You must be able to make decisions effectively. And if you actually allow 5 minutes to run, you'll have a list that is a mile long. And I don't need to say this to you. You figure this out for yourself, right? No one person can be all of this. A person who's visionary might not necessarily become a really, really good operational tactician. These are two very different competencies. Somebody who can effectively communicate might not be the best person to ideate. A person who ideates might not be the best person to practically implement it. And the person who can do all of this might not necessarily be a great team player. So you can't really expect one individual to have all of these competencies pattered down to a T and be brilliant at all of it. It's just a fallacy. It's not practically possible. So whenever we talk about leadership, we make the horrible mistake of trying to pin all of these things down and subscribe the success or the failure of the organization or the team to that one person who miraculously came out and did all of this. And that's the one thing I want to shed out today. Because if that is the paradigm we work out of, then chances are we will never have great organizations that thrive, especially in today's environment. And I'll come to that in a minute. So this whole great man concept, I think, is one of the past. I don't think even in historical terms it actually worked. It's just that we've always identified the leader as the person who's on top, and that's a fallacy to begin with. Alexander the Great, yes, was a great emperor, but was he the only person who led? Of course not. There was a group of people around him who supported him in his leadership position, and that therefore was a collective effort. The fact that Alexander the Great took all of these decisions and was able to strategically take a group of people to building an empire by himself doesn't hold true, and doesn't hold true for any material on leadership. Next slide. So, what are we supposed to do? Well, let's re-look at leadership as a process and not a person, and a collective process at that. So, if you take away the word a person, leadership is a person who takes an organization towards or a group of people towards a common objective. And you use the word process. Leadership is the process by which a group is driven towards a common objective. What happens is, by definition, anyone who is part of that process in whatever capacity becomes a leader. And I think that's a fundamentally important shift for you to have. So let me kind of pause for a moment and let's digest this, right? Understand that leadership means very different things at different levels of an organization. At the very top, what you talk about as visioning is absolutely critical, of course. But visions need to be executed. And most of the time, people who come up with the vision aren't necessarily the people who execute it. Once again, go back to Alexander the Great. He had a vision of an empire, but he didn't execute it by himself. He had an entire army and a group of people and support structures that believed in that vision. Now, when you contribute towards that vision, does that make you a leader or does that make you a follower? Now, just because you actually are right at the apex of it doesn't mean that you're the only one who are making decisions and that you're the only one who's leading. It does mean that the rest of the people lead too in different capacities. And that collective whole is what enables the vision to translate into reality. Therefore, in a process, different people at different times interject into the vision by way of their own leadership and their contribution towards leadership into that specific purpose or objective. Right. Let's dive into that a little bit more. Now, if you want to read a book on this, and this got me starting. In fact, this was the book that I read about probably a good 15 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, that got me really started on the idea of collective leadership and thinking about it a lot more in detail. Now, the book talks about the analogy of a spider and a starfish. Now, a spider, they relate to as a typical organization. A typical organization is built on one person, and you look at leadership as the very top, and you take the head off, and the entire organization collapses, just like if you take the head off of a spider, well, the creature dies. Whereas a starfish, you can actually take out each of the legs of, if you want to call it that, of a starfish, but it doesn't die, it functions by itself. So there you can chop it up into small pieces and it still functions. Why? Because it is not centrally managed. And a starfish was the analogy they brought in for what the authors call leaderless organizations, where you're driven by a passion or a purpose that everyone shares. The downside, at the flip side to this, unfortunately, is the entire model was built on rather unfortunately, it was built on terrorist organizations that were designed, the research was done on terrorist organizations. How do terrorist cells function without central leadership? And they brought in this example from ISIS and everybody else, and like Al Qaeda and so on and so forth. You can take the head out of Al Qaeda, but Al Qaeda still functions. The same is true of terrorist organizations all over the world, including Sri Lanka. You can have it beaten militarily for a moment in time by taking out the nominal leader, so to say. But it still functions. It still grows sometimes, and it still has devastating effect, which is why most of the typical armies of the world can never quite defeat terrorism in the traditional sense. It's not commonplace warfare. Leadership, they turned around and said, should take the same plunge. You shouldn't actually follow a leader. What you should be following is a mission or a purpose. Now, when everyone switched on towards that, you have what you call collective leadership. A small illustration of how terrorist cells function. Terrorist cells functions each in their own right. They're not centrally managed. They're not centrally financed. They're not centrally led either. The logistics, support, the missions they carry out are all independent of each other. Sometimes, in fact, they don't even know there's another terrorist cell in their own town. It doesn't matter as long as the purpose is and the objective is being met. The organization functions. And therefore, you can take out each cell at a time, but another cell will spring up and it'll come up with their own plans. It doesn't matter whether the devastation was very small or massive. As long as the core objective is being met, then the organization functions. Now, that's a pretty radical way of looking at leadership, and also a very, very extreme example that the book cited. But that got me thinking, can this be applied as a principle, as a methodology to leadership? Because we needed to be agile. Don't forget, after COVID, gone are the days where we can actually sit down, do strategic planning for 2 years, 3 years. In fact, you'll be lucky to have a strategic plan that works for 6 months because the world is so volatile. In that kind of a context where predictability is null and void, would you be able to centrally manage large organizations, especially when you scale it to a certain size? If you're a 5-man team, well, you don't necessarily need this. But when you're a 100-man team, 200-man team, 1,000-man team, 10,000-man team, when you have large organizations of that nature, would you be able to centrally manage and allow people to have leadership in the traditional great man pyramid complex that we are used to? And the answer is no, you can't. And that's why most organizations actually fail in these kind of environments. Next slide. So if you want to look at this, you have to look at it from a different perspective, and you have to look at it from an ecosystem perspective. Let me give you a quick example of ecosystems. My son, by the way, loves ornamental fish, something that he and Anton actually share. And they're mad over fish. They collect some weird species of fish, most of whom I didn't even know existed. But take a look at a typical tank, right? And take a look at a pond, and take a look at a river. All three of them have ecosystems, but they are very, very different by way of the interventions you need to have in order for it to thrive. Now, in a tank, there's a huge advantage. You can actually control everything inside the tank. You have aeration, you have lighting, you have plants growing. The fish will thrive in a good tank. But notice the fact that if you run out of electricity, as we do in Sri Lanka sometimes, and that's not a common problem for the US, I understand, but in Sri Lanka, we do have power cuts ever so often. In fact, for a long time, we had about 6 to 7 hours of power cuts because of the financial crisis we are going through. Now, on one of those days where you have no electricity for 7 hours, chances are your fish will die because you do not give the ecosystem what it needs to thrive. So in a fish tank, your intervention, the human intervention, is huge. Everything is dependent on it. Provided you can do this daily, consistently, fish thrive. Take a look at a pond. The pond, you need much less of intervening if you take a look at the overall amount of time that you need to put into it. But if you take a look at a river, you don't need any intervening at all, as long as you just leave it be, unless you have extreme circumstances of a drought or something like that. The fish and everything else around it just happens. So from one extreme of a fish tank where you have to have constant messing around with it to um, a natural ecosystem, all three of these actually have positives and negatives. Notice the fact that you can't see the fish in a river. In a pond, you have some luck in being able to see it a little bit, but you're the downside of a kingfisher coming and taking some fish away. In a river, you have no idea what is happening. You really don't, right? If you want to go and see fish in a river, you will have to wear a pair of goggles and try and kind of do a little bit of, diving around, which is very awkward to do. If you go into the sea with goggles, people will, not raise eyebrows. But imagine going around a river with goggles and trying to see fish in it. But you do know that fish exist. There are signs of it, and there are ways of measuring it, but it's a completely different way of looking at an ecosystem. Now, why am I telling you this? Because leadership skills that you need for different ecosystems are very, very different. What we are used to is what I call an ecosystem of leadership. I am the leader, thou art the follower, you shall do what I tell you to do. Now, we do talk about things like servant leadership, and you spoke about it as well. You put a lot of this into the chat when I talked about characteristics of a leader and what do you mean by leadership. You turned around and said things like you need to be able to listen, you need to be able to be empathetic. Those are all characteristics, yes, but it's still about me. I'm still talking about me. Ego-based leadership, even if it is servant leadership, still revolves around me as the leader versus everybody else who's a follower. So the problem with that is that we have not built in the competencies we need to collaborate as equals. Now, collaborating in leadership looks very different to delegating and empowering people. To delegate and empower, you're still the boss. You're still giving part of your capability and power to somebody else. You can always take it back. But if you have collective leadership, you don't have that. And the way you operate is very different. You go by merit of an argument, not about the position you hold. You do not have the authority to veto somebody necessarily in that sense. You step up and you instinctively know. It's a bit like playing rugby or American football. You can't call everything out. You instinctively know you need to pass the ball and somebody else need to instinctively catch it. You can't be calling it out all the time. Hey, you know what, man? I'm passing it to you. Now take it and run with it. It doesn't work like that. It just happens. You're in flow, as we call it. Now, how do you create flow? In sports, it's very easy. You don't see a footballer turning around and saying, "Hey, mate, do you want this ball? Ah, okay, let me pass it back to you. Ah, come on, now it's click. Can you pass it back to me?" It doesn't work that way. There's a constant state of flow, and great teams have this. And coaches inbuilt it by doing a whole heap of plays that you know almost instinctively to execute. How do you do that in leadership? Now, that is a skill, that is a competency, which is fundamentally different to you being able to make decisions, to you being able to communicate as an individual. So, that whole collaborative piece needs to come in, and it needs to come in as a core competency that you develop inside the organization. Next slide, Anton. So, how would that look like? Now, you can take a lot of inspiration from activism as well. And if you take a look at how organizations that are into environmental activism actually work, they actually think and act at the same time, but it's like almost a collective bunch of people coming up with an idea all at the same time. Great ideas are not just born out of one individual or one brilliance. It is collective brilliance. I would come up with an idea, you would pick holes on it, somebody else will look at how to use it practically. We will all brainstorm this, and at some point it stops being my idea. it starts becoming our idea. And that's what think tanks do. And what they're focused on is not just an academic piece of research, they're looking at action research, which is doing something about climate change practically. Also, notice the fact that there is an activism system itself that looks at delivering this change. And of course, there is leadership development that is taking place. They don't really care who's in charge, who's not in charge, and they don't worry about what that organization looks like. What matters predominantly, what preoccupies your mind is how do we get this done? And as long as it's taking place, what role I play, it doesn't really matter. Next slide. So ultimately, what we are looking at from a collective leadership perspective is leadership as a system that governs the organization and how leadership looks like inside the organizational setting. Notice the fact that we need to have a complex system in itself by way of governance, protocols, HR policies, the accountability matrices, the linkages to career advancement. How am I seen for my leadership capability? All of this needs to change because the fundamental competencies like being able to collectively work on something, being able to lead and follow at the same time, being able to step back when required and allow somebody else to lead because you know that person is better suited for that particular piece of work. All of these things need to be in the system itself. You need to be told, here's how we govern ourselves. On the other side, if you take a look at the community itself of people around the leaders, followers need to be able to step up and become leaders. Leaders need to be able to step back and become followers. This needs to be an interchangeable play. And the community that with other stakeholders outside of the organization needs to have the same principle. In fact, this is what places like Google do best. They connect with stakeholders, shareholders, even people who are users of the applications seamlessly, and they are able to bring out what they need to bring out inside the organization. And ultimately, all of these things, the system as well as the stakeholders and the community at large holds leaders accountable. Now, that is critical. One of the beautiful things about collective leadership is that you hold yourself accountable, at the same time, others around you hold you accountable. The fact that you're a leader doesn't mean anything in a collective leadership context because you are a community of leaders. You're not just one individual leader that everyone looks up to and has all the power enshrined in you. Now, if you have that kind of a leader, whatever you say, you can't hold that person accountable because he is in a different hierarchical position to that of you. How are you expected to keep that person accountable? It just doesn't happen in a traditional organization. The boss would say something and you would have to do, well, 90% of the time, you'll have to just do as you're told. So that paradigm needs to shift. Now, when that happens, you actually have to have collaborative leadership skills that you inculcate in individuals and teams in order to be able to operate in this kind of ecosystem. Now, one small warning, which is you need to be a lot more mature and a lot more transparent than you have ever been in your life in this kind of an ecosystem. You cannot hide behind a title. You cannot hide behind positions of power and say, hey, you know what, let's slide this under the carpet. It doesn't work that way. And if you do, then the whole system collapses. And that is why you have systems in place that disallows an individual to do that. Now, I do know this is sounding pretty conceptual at this moment in time, but let me give you 3 examples of this after giving you one small illustration of how you can institutionalize this. Now, what you do is you flip the pyramid. Now, this doesn't mean that you abolish the hierarchy. The hierarchy still exists. In fact, the hierarchy is the only thing that has stood us in good stead for the last 3,500 years. I don't think we can exist as a human race without some form of hierarchy. The issue is not the hierarchy. It is about what the hierarchy does. Now imagine flipping the hierarchy and saying the leadership depends on the different levels. And what does it exist for? Well, at the senior most level, at the very bottom of the pyramid, if you invert it, the seniors are right at the bottom. What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to create ecosystems where everyone can contribute positively. That's the role of the senior management team. And by ecosystem, I don't mean only culture. I mean systems, I mean processes, I need governance protocols. And of course, your behavior would ensure that the organization exists to bring out the best in people and make sure that you contribute positively towards the vision, mission, and the purpose of the organization. Now, what does the middle management tier supposed to do? Well, what they're supposed to do is to actively mentor, coach, and groom individuals for them to actually become better than what they are at this moment in time. Now, if you do that, what are the junior most people supposed to do? Well, very simple. They're expected to actively engage in leadership from the get-go. It doesn't matter how insignificant your role is. Maybe you're the janitor inside the organization, but maybe you spot something and you can lead that initiative in order to make sure that you contribute positively towards the organization's purpose. Making sure I step up towards that role rather than saying, hey, you know what am I supposed to do? I'm just the janitor. I'm just the newbie. I'm the one who's making a cup of tea for everyone. So I don't need to partake in any of this. Let me just be what I am by the role that I'm defined. Without having that mindset, actually coming into the flow of things is what juniors are supposed to do. Now imagine an organization with an inverted pyramid like that and understand how differently it will function to a typical hierarchy where you wait for orders from the top and turn around and say, hey, you know what, mate, that's not my job. I have been given a job and that's all I do. So it looks fundamentally different. Now, the big ask, does this actually happen in practice, or is this wonderful fairy tales, bedtime story just before we go to sleep? It's a little late in the afternoon. This is wonderful. Let's go back to sleep because, hey, this is not going to happen in reality. It only happens in the land of dreams. It's not really true. Take a look at the Ritz-Carlton. Why do you think they offer superlative service beyond expectations of everyone else? Now, does the Ritz-Carlton make mistakes? Of course they do. Plenty times. If you take a look at the service level standards of the Ritz-Carlton, it's off the charts consistently over a period of time and decades. Why? Because people are enabled to a large extent to make decisions. Here's a wonderful little statement from the Ritz-Carlton. In the Ritz-Carlton, it turns around and says, you do not have permission to say no to a customer. In most typical organizations, we don't have the authority to say yes to a customer. But in the Ritz-Carlton, you don't have the authority to say no. You have to seek somebody else's permission to say no to somebody. So the idea is that you're working from the perspective that I don't care whether I'm a bellboy or a steward or a waiter or a manager. If a customer has a problem, I have every authority to solve that problem. And not just the authority, but I've had the training, I've had the grooming, I've had the coaching, and I have the entire system supporting me to make sure that the customer is served. That's collective leadership from a service mindset perspective. Take a look at 3M, which is universally known for its creativity and its innovation and the products and post-its and all the rest of it. Why do you think that works? Because inside 3M, yes, for administrative purposes, there is a rigid hierarchy, there is a CEO, there is a management structure underneath it. But leadership is not management. There in 3M, if you have an idea, you have been given the mandate to come and pitch that idea in front of the board. In fact, to get funding like an entrepreneur to make that concept a reality. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is easy and you just get money to do whatever you want. Of course not. There is a rigorous process around it. But it is a collective process. It's not something where you're told, hey, you know what, you're a junior level person. If you have an idea, you have to jump through so many hoops in order to get there. No, not so. The process is collective. But the most radical example of collective leadership I have come across actually comes from our little island. And it's a place called Dankotua Porcelain, which makes porcelain ware. And this company, which didn't make any money for 15 years in a row, got bought over newly. A new CEO was brought in. He didn't change a single person inside the organization, but did something radically different in running the business. What he did was he broke the entire management team into 6 different groups, right? And in these 6 groups, they had a motley crew of people, starting from a senior manager all the way to a junior level young executive. And they broke this management team and turned around and said, every 2 months, one group is going to run the P&L of the organization, right? Imagine how radical that sounds. Now, they came up with a strategy and a plan and everything else, but the execution of this ultimately rests on the team that is running it for those 2 months. Cut a long story short, 2 years ago, when they experimented with this, for the first time in 10 or 15 years, they made a profit and they made the best financial year they've ever seen. Last year, which was the second year in experimenting with this concept, they brought in a second group of people. In our parlance in Sri Lanka, what we call executives are the junior most level, not the senior most level, right? So you have CEO, managers, executives. Right? Unlike the states where the CXO sits right at the top or executives sit right at the top. So they brought in 6 groups again, but this time the management team was only 5 groups, and they brought in one more group as young executives, entry level people who are just joining in the organization, who's been there for about 4 or 5 years, but from a rank perspective, very, very low in the hierarchy. And they ran this again, which means every 2 months, the running of the business moves into a team, which is cross-functional and not hierarchical. Collectively, they're responsible for running the show. And last year, they did 50% more than the previous year, which was their best year, which means they did 50% more profit and top line than the best financial year that they had. In something like they hit their numbers in 7 to 8 months. Right? Phenomenal. And this year, they're trying to actually do 50% more than last year. And if indications are anything to go by, well, they're going to hit numbers again. The stock market price and the valuation of the organization has gone through the roof, and they're still grappling with why exactly this is working. But I subscribe it to 3 simple reasons. Number one, I honestly think that we as human beings are capable instinctively of collaborating with each other as much as competing with each other. Competition is something that we are taught from childhood. Sadly, collaboration isn't taught to us, but instinctively we know how to collaborate. We couldn't have existed as a human race if we didn't collaborate. So I think number one, we know instinctive to collaborate if we are given the opportunity to. Secondly, when we do start collaborating, we realize that we can actually all contribute better and actually make more of it if we do it and we keep our egos at the doorstep and don't have this attitude of measurement of saying I have a better car than yours versus contribute something much more positive towards humanity itself, secondly. And thirdly, when we start institutionalizing this and we realize that the overall organization grows, we are not asking for a part of the pie. We are actually making the pie bigger so that there's more for all of us. And it's those 3 principles that govern what is going right inside Dankotua porcelain. In fact, right now there's a lot of academic fervor to study Dankotua porcelain as well, because there is something phenomenal taking place, and it's a wonderful case study to find out how collective leadership works. So on that note, let me give you a quick summary. So we started out by challenging the whole great man principle of leadership and asking the question, is leadership a noun or a verb? And to understand leadership from a process perspective, you have to understand that we all have a contribution to make. We also looked at the fact that at different levels of the organization, leadership does look differently, but each one of those elements and perspectives to leadership and contribution towards leadership is equally important. And it doesn't mean that you're the only leader, that there's leadership right across the organization. And in that, what matters is that you're able to switch between leader and follower simultaneously. Right now, I might be leading, and tomorrow you might be leading, day after somebody else might be leading, and afterwards, finally, you will find that all of us somehow come together towards making sure that the objective is met. And finally, we looked at how that translates into three different paradigms: a leaderless organization, or a systems approach to leadership, or a process related approach to leadership, where the pyramid of typical hierarchies actually can get flipped into leadership being something that is becoming an enabler versus the last bastion of bureaucracy. So if you invert the pyramid and make sure that the senior leadership team builds ecosystems that enables other people to thrive, middle management tiers embrace that and makes sure that the juniors are brought into the fold, and the juniors actively contribute towards the leadership process rather than doing a role defined by a job description and simply getting stuck into that. Then we change the entire landscape of leadership, and collective leadership comes into play. And finally, we looked at a couple of examples, both from well-known organizations as well as from our little island, where collective leadership has actually been given flight and where great things are taking place. So on that note, I'll stop my ticker slides and allow you to ask questions. And this is where I always say that the rubber meets the road, because this is where the fun part is. So on that note, questions, which is what I love the most.
Thank you so much, Vidusha. Please, for all of our attendees on the line, we welcome you to put your questions into the chat. We'll give you just a little bit of time to enter those, but we have a lead-off question for you, Vidusha. Just as we're waiting for people to put their questions into the chat, we welcome all of our attendees to do so. So culturally, what have you seen to be most effective from when shifting from old school leadership models to new collective leadership models?
Sure. So culturally, there is one element of culture that I think plays a huge role in this, which is what we call power distance. What is the distance between, a senior and a junior? And countries like Sri Lanka, and I think to a large extent even America, Scandinavia has it much less. We are hierarchical by nature. We are inbred into this. And in fact, when you're, born, I still remember. Can I digress for a moment and give you a quick a story? Is that permitted?
Oh, please.
Right. So I always joke about the fact that my father used to call himself a liberal, but he's probably the most despotic father you can find. It's his way or the highway. And I still remember, because it's April. April is our new year. Every April, he would actually ask me. I was an only child, so they would come and ask me when I was about 5 years old. Hey, you know what? Where would you want to go for the holidays? And I come from really, really middle class families. I often kind of say that I come from a poor background, and my mother looks at me sideways and says, no, 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 we were never poor, don't lie. So I kind of change it to saying middle class. I felt poor, I must admit. So we didn't have the money to go abroad for holidays, but mom and dad would always take us for holidays somewhere around the island. And he would every year, like a prayer, come and ask me, where would you like to go, son? And I would throw some exotic destination inside the island. And he would find some excuse never to go there. and, and he would always end up in Norelia, which we call Little England, because it has that same climatic condition as the UK does. So eventually I went and asked my dad, why do you ask me this? I have places I want to go, but you don't want to go there. So you might as well go where you want to go. Why ask me? And he looks at me and turns around and says, because all the places that you want to go to are impractical. We had a 30-year war, a civil war going on in Sri Lanka. And certain parts were inaccessible. The other places were really hot and, et cetera, et cetera. And he would always tell me, you are impractical, you don't want to go, you don't want to go to normal places. And I stopped arguing with him at some point. So we are brought up in this tradition, isn't it? Most of the time. Go to school, we have prefects who would come into class and punish us if you were not doing what you were supposed to do. So we have a rigid hierarchy growing up, and the power distance is quite large. So when you're an entry level person and when you are right at the top of the organization, there's a huge disparity between the two levels of hierarchy. And it doesn't, my dogs, apologies. I have fellows who kind of come and take a look at what I'm doing. So there you go. That's one of them, and who wants to come and say hi to you guys, right? So 9 times out of 10, you would have this issue where you can't necessarily challenge a person outright. So when you're moving from traditional hierarchy-based leadership positions and organizations and trying to move into a more collective space, culturally, if you come from a culture of high power distance like we do, this is a rude awakening. This is a rude shock. And it's very difficult unless you train people to be able to be okay to function in this kind of environment. It's almost impossible to do it. Now, the good news is that when you start putting systems in place, ecosystems in place, processors in place that supports this kind of thinking, we shift very, very quickly. And once again, let me go back to Danko to a porcelain. The shift they made happened in 3 months of the new CEO coming in. I guess it helped because they were making losses and they were in dire straits as an organization. So they were probably more receptive to do something radical and see how it goes. But they adapted. It's the same group of people. They never fired a single person. They never brought a new person in apart from the CEO. So you imagine a group of people, a management team that made losses for 15 years, being able to flip and pivot and being able to make profits in just 6 to 7 months and finish the year with the best results ever. So I think we as human beings will adapt very quickly, provided we create the environments that are required for that. And culture will set in as an organizational culture that way, rather than the national culture that overrides it. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I love it. I love that you really spoke about the impetus, right? The change factor that allowed them to pivot as well. Thank you, Vidusha. I think we have a question in the chat. So from Jane, the flipped hierarchy of leadership, where leaders support the organization and allow individuals to perform and excel, is similar to leadership for an innovative organization. Can you comment on the influence of the leadership system as you've described it on innovation and innovative organizations?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question. I honestly think that you can't innovate without collective leadership. I really do. Um, Now, you might, if you come from the subcontinent like I do, our mothers take credit for most of what we do. I don't know whether that happens in the UK, but I swear our mothers take credit for everything. So if you do well in school, it's because I sat you down and made sure that you studied, and they go and brag about it with a lot of love and regard. But it's eventually the son had nothing to do with it. I didn't have to study. It's my mother who got me to study. You know. But even in that kind of thing, if you take a look at it really, if you do well in your studies, let's just move aside from an innovation organization for a moment. Take a look at you as an individual. If you did well, you really can't tell me you did it by yourself. I can't take credit for my own success. It never works that way. Of course, if you come from a hierarchical system, your boss takes credit for it, which my mother does all the time, even now. But if you really look at it, it was a collective effort, wasn't it? My mom would have given me a certain environment for me to be able to study and would have supported me through that. My dad would have contributed towards it. My other siblings, I come from a very large extended family. I have 48 cousins or so. I've lost track at some point. My dad's family has 11 in the family. Each of them had about 4 or 5 kids. So we have a large extended family. For some weird reason, I ended up being by myself. So I come from an extended family. So they were all around when I was growing up. So they would have supported me. And of course, I would have done my part too. So if you take a look at innovations taking place, it's not just results. Innovations is the birth of new ideas and being able to execute it in a market condition. That's a lot more than just bringing in results. So if you want to have innovation taking place, you really can't have one person thinking about all of these ideas and then telling everybody else, hey, you know what, I had a great idea. Here we go. This is what we do. Doesn't work that way. In fact, there has been research done on this, very critical research, and they say that the best ideas come in coffee shops, in conversations, because the back and forth of an idea is what actually gives it form. Until then, it's just a figment of your imagination. But what gives it form is you bouncing it off somebody else. So, in this kind of thing, where does it come into play for innovative or innovation led organizations? I think it's fundamental. It is far more important that you have leadership ecosystems in place for innovations to take place. You can't put KPIs and drive people towards innovation. It doesn't happen that way. People need to be inspired. How do you want people to be inspired to simply execute somebody else's idea? It doesn't work that way. So if you really want to practically look at it, and again, I go back to places like 3M or Google or Apple. Why are people inspired? Because they feel as if though this is our idea, not my boss's idea that I have to execute. This is our idea that we are trying to put out into the market. It's a collective ownership of it. Again, I'll give you a quick, simple example of it. When the Macintosh was first developed, and this I thought was beautiful, they made sure that the first Macintosh team, because they wanted to make sure that every single person who contributed towards making the Macintosh happen. You remember in those days, we didn't have flat screen TVs, right? So you had a tube for the TV or the monitor. Inside the monitor, inside the tube, carved into every single piece of work that was produced as a Macintosh is the signature of every single person inside the Mac team who contributed towards making the Mac happen, which is an acknowledgement of the collective effort that went into it and immortalizing it. So every single piece of equipment that came out of the production line, actually inside the shell where the tube is, has the signatures of every single person. So I do think that the system needs to be in place for innovation to actually happen. Now, whether you call it collective leadership or not is inconsequential. The principle is at play. I hope I answered your question. Jane, I do hope I answered it for you.
Thank
You
you
have a
so very
follow-up question.
much. Yes. Okay. Another question around the shift. And during the collective leadership shift, where have you seen the most resistance arise, and how did you and your team handle that in order to help the organization move forward?
So again, thank you for the question. I did warn you, Rhonda, that I'm not the most politically correct person. So I beg forgiveness for speaking my mind. The biggest resistance generally comes from middle management tiers. And I'm guilty as charged in doing this. So again, let me give you a simple example of it. So long years ago, when I was working in fact, most of you probably from the US would know this organization. I used to work for a company called Sara Lee Corporation, which was a US-based organization, and probably Sara Lee cheesecake is probably the most known out of the Sara Lee products. But they had tea and coffee and a host of other products as well. So I used to work for part of Sara Lee that made manufactured garments, and Hanes and Burley and Aristoc and Wonderbra and things like that used to be Sara Lee brands. And this was a large organization, and we had one of our senior managers was from the States itself, and he came down, looked at our organization and was aghast because we had little cubicles and hierarchical systems in the office. So you could actually walk into office and know exactly who the boss was, because that was the corner office. And then if you're a junior level manager, you had a smaller office. And if you're a nobody, well, you had just a desk. And he looked at this and turned it around and said, you know what? We need to change this. We need to have an open plan office. And I was one of the first people to react to this, because I had just got promoted into being a manager. I just got my room and my cubicle, and I worked really hard for this. And I didn't want to give it up, because then I'm like everyone else. I had just the same desk and the same chair that everyone else had. So the entire middle management resisted this. And I still remember this. And I'm putting my hand up as an individual and saying I'm guilty as charged of this. But thankfully, boss saw this through, and how it did it was quite radical. We walked in after a long holiday for our New Year. April, as I said, is our New Year period, and we generally shut down factories and plants for nearly a week or two. When we came back after our New Year holidays, he had made the change, and all of them were just open desks with our names on the desk. So we walked in and we looked at it and said, "Oh, dear, okay." So you sat there, and that was it. Because what can you do? You can't go back. And this incident actually stuck in my mind, because the way you go about change sometimes, especially when it comes to shifting cultures, is to be able to not go back to the former self. That is critical. So the people who resist is actually people who have built power bases and rely on power rather than leadership, rather than leveraging influence that relies solely on power to get things done. Now, the moment you get used to barking out orders and people following it up, you don't have any other skills. And it was a rude awakening for me to be able to shift into that paradigm. It took a while. But the key to being able to shift is not to be able to go back to your normal self. And that is key. So let me give you 3 pieces of advice on how to make that shift, especially with middle management. Number one, strengthen your juniors to be able to ask questions without having to worry about repercussions. And that's critical. Juniors must challenge the seniors, not the seniors challenging the juniors. The juniors must challenge the seniors. Notice the fact that every single right we have won as a human race came from the masses rising up and saying, we demand that this right be recognized. It didn't come because of the benevolence of the seniors who were there. It doesn't work that way. We need, now I'm not talking of armed struggle. I'm talking of resistance in a way that you make people feel this is my birthright, I need to have this. And how you go about it is different, but it is about the organization rising up and saying we think we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. That's number one. Number two is we must make sure that the middle management tiers and the senior management tiers are trained in the competencies they need to have in order to work in this new paradigm. That is also critical. Most people turn around and say, throw people into the deep end and see what happens. You know what happens when you throw people into the deep end without them knowing how to swim? You drown and you kill yourself. It will be 1% of people who actually survive. And that's not a success rate you want to work with. So equip them with the right competencies and skills. And the third one is really important. Not to say the first two aren't, but the third one is the linchpin that makes the first two happen. The third one is put systems in place that disallows somebody to get promoted into a middle management or senior management position simply because they perform the objectives well. Do not promote people on results. You need to promote people on the values they hold. So if you make sure that you reward people and recognize people for performance, I'm not saying no, the increments, bonuses, all of that can be on performance. But the moment you get people to come into a team leadership role, the moment you move people up to being responsible for others apart from your just your job, the moment you take up a leadership position, you must be measured for your values and the contributions you make towards others. If your performance management system and your career and succession planning system has not been differentiated and you simply promote the best performing people only with no skill whatsoever to truly lead and inspire people, then the entire system fails. Then you would not have juniors actually challenging the seniors, and you will not be equipping the seniors with the skill sets because they will not see the need to acquire those skills. So those 3 things, if you do, you will start creating that ecosystem that we spoke about. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, so very grateful. And our last question, because I know this person put it in the chat and I don't want to leave them hanging before we close for tonight, Vidusha. Who is responsible for creating the environment for the leadership model you define to be most successful, please?
Right. Thank you for the question. And I unfortunately I'm going to beg forgiveness for stepping over time for just 2 minutes because there are 2 answers to this question. It honestly depends on the kind of cultures you come from. Now, if you move into the Scandinavian environments, which are far less, the power distance is much, much less. If you go to Japan, they have a much more collective subconscious, if you want to call it that, than we do in Sri Lanka or in India. So if you come from that kind of environment, you can do this collectively. In fact, there are organizations based out of Brussels, based out of there's a consulting company called The Way We Work. There are lots of little organizations. When I mean little, I mean by Fortune 500 standards. They're still talking of 1,000, 2,000 people working inside those organizations. So they're still large by Sri Lankan standards, but relatively small. In those kind of environments, you can do this collectively. Who's responsible for it? You can be collectively responsible. You can co-create this. But if you come from our kind of environments, I think the onus of building this ecosystem, propagating that ecosystem, and giving it the foundational strength it requires to first take form and then sustain itself lies very much on the senior management teams. You cannot have this coming bottom up in our kind of cultures. So I think it depends on what kind of a national culture and an organizational culture you come from. So for most organizations, I think if you want to move in with this direction, you do need the senior management team setting the pace for it, leading by example, and creating it and allowing it and giving it a certain amount of time for it to flourish. Once it flourishes, it takes a life form of its own. It's a bit like creating an artificial lake or an artificial river. You can create it and keep it after some time, and it takes a life form of its own. You don't need to tamper with it. But the same won't happen in a fish tank. So I think in our kind of cultures, I really do think it needs to start from the top. It wouldn't work otherwise. I hope I answered your question.
Again, a huge hand to our phenomenal speaker, Vidusha. We are so pleased with your overview tonight, and we are so grateful for all of the information you shared, for pushing us forward, for giving us this great new model and methodology that we can think about how we could potentially change what we're seeing in the areas where we have influence, and then all this great wisdom that we can then take and apply. Thank you so much. We are so very grateful. For all of you still on the line, we invite you to engage with us, join us, and support us, the ASQ Innovation TC. In the deck that will be sent out to each of you, you'll have a link to join us in a discussion in our My ASQ portal. You'll also find ASQE Insights on Excellence that speak to innovation topics and how you might be able to apply innovation, particularly to your industry that you're involved with. If you're not already a member of ASQ and ASQE, there'll be a link for you to find out more and the benefits available to you. And we invite you to the next two sessions, one on May 18th, the next on June 22nd. May will be talking with Miss Rebecca Mott, our chair of the ASQ Innovation TC for this year. She'll be speaking about innovation keys, the building blocks for employee engagement. And in June, Miss Grace Duffy will be speaking about innovation, your solution for weathering uncertainty. We welcome all of you to register for both of those. I'm sure they'll be phenomenal, just like our guest speaker and host tonight, Vidusha. And we wish you an innovation-filled 2023. Sharing here tonight are ASQ Innovation TC 2023 officers, our chair, Ms. Rebecca Mott, our chair-elect, Ms. Michelle Vargas, our secretary, Ms. Jackie Jolly, and our treasurer, Mr. Larry Miller. We are always looking for good men and women to join our team as volunteers to put you into a leader pipeline and toward just if you want to be an innovation evangelist and advocate. We'd love to have your support. So again, thank you so very much for joining us this evening as Vidusha spoke about collective leadership and how that will be and is the future of leadership going forward. This is ASQ Innovation TC signing off for tonight. We welcome you back at our future events. And thanks again to our wonderful guest speaker and his trusty business partner, Anton.
Thank you for having us. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.